The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Sergeant Carolyn Hayes marched toward the rust-red gates of Fort Benning's Sniper School. The Georgia air was heavy with humidity, thick enough to cling to her uniform and press down on her shoulders, as though it had weight of its own. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, sharp and uneven, the sound cutting through the otherwise still morning. Ahead, the silhouette of the training compound rose like a fortress, its plain buildings hiding a course infamous for breaking soldiers who had never been broken before. Sniper School wasn't designed to educate. It was designed to destroy. Out of dozens who started each cycle, only a handful would finish. The rest would limp home carrying stories of exhaustion, humiliation, and failure. Those who survived emerged with the small, silver tab that carried enormous weight proof they could operate unseen, calculating death from impossible distances. That tab was revered, feared, and rarely given. For Caroline, it was more than a piece of metal. It was the answer to years of whispers, doubts, and sideways glances. She had heard them long before this morning. In the barracks, in the field, even back home during holidays, when old neighbors learned what she did for a living. Your infantry? That's unusual for a woman. Or worse, the ones who smiled condescendingly, convinced she was tucked away in some desk job rather than hauling gear and firing rifles beside the men. She didn't waste energy correcting them anymore. She saved that energy for mornings like this, when her resolve needed to be sharper than any blade. The other candidates gathered in a loose formation on the gravel parade ground, shifting under the weight of their rucksacks. There were hardened infantrymen, seasoned rangers, and quiet Marines who had been selected to cross-train. Each carried the kind of resume that turned heads, yet Caroline's presence drew the most attention. She caught snippets of muttered voices as she moved into formation. She won't last a week. Looks too clean. Sniper School eat her alive. Hope she brought tissues. She didn't flinch. Years in uniform had taught her that silence was stronger than confrontation. Every second wasted on proving herself with words was a second stolen from focus, and focus was the only currency that mattered here. An instructor emerged from the barracks, his presence commanding silence. Tall, built like steel forged into human form, he wore the sniper tab on his chest like a scar won in battle. His voice barked across the field with the kind of authority that froze spines. Listen up. This school doesn't care who you are, where you came from, or what stories you tell at the bar. Your rifle will tell the truth. Your discipline will tell the truth. And the truth doesn't care about excuses. Understand? Yes, Sergeant. The formation thundered back. Caroline's response was as sharp as the others, but she felt the difference in how it landed. The instructors already knew her name. They knew the gamble she was taking by even showing up. The question wasn't whether she could shoot. Her service record proved that. The question was whether she could endure the pressure of an institution waiting for her to crack. The morning bled into assessments. Equipment checks came first. Each candidate laid out their gear, rifles disassembled and cleaned, optics gleaming under the unforgiving sun. Instructors moved down the rows like hawks, scanning for the slightest imperfection. One candidate's bolt assembly carried a smudge of oil. He was dropped on the spot. Another's rucksack straps were frayed. He was given a strike against his name. Carolyn presented her gear with meticulous care, every item scrubbed, aligned, and inspected twice the night before. The instructor paused at her station, eyes narrowing at her rifle. He lifted the barrel, peering through the bore, then glanced at her expression. She held his gaze, calm and unflinching. With a grunt, he set the weapon back down and moved on. She let out a slow breath. One hurdle cleared. 1,000 remained. The physical tests followed. Candidates were ordered to shoulder 70-pound rucks and march across miles of uneven terrain under the hammering Georgia sun. Dust rose in choking clouds as boots pounded dirt trails. Some men stumbled, sweat darkening their uniforms in blotches. Caroline kept her pace measured, her breathing controlled, her eyes locked on the soldier's back ahead of her. Her legs burned, her shoulders screamed, but she refused to fall behind. Each step was a declaration. She wasn't here as an experiment. She was here to finish. At the halfway point, an instructor's voice cut through the air. "Pick it up, Sergeant Hayes. Don't let them see you drag." Caroline tightened her grip on the straps, straightened her back, and surged forward. The candidate beside her glanced over, smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't think you'd make it this far?" he muttered between breaths. She didn't answer. The gravel road stretched ahead, long and punishing, but she focused only on the rhythm of her boots. Left, right. Left, right. Silence became her weapon, steady determination her shield. By the time the march ended, several candidates had collapsed to the sidelines, medics hauling them into shade. Caroline dropped her ruck at the finish line, chest heaving but eyes steady. She was still standing. That night in the barracks, exhaustion pressed down like a weight. Soldiers sprawled across bunks, some nursing blisters, others massaging aching shoulders. Caroline sat on the edge of her bed, cleaning her rifle in silence. A pair of voices drifted from across the room. "She won't survive stalking week. No way she hides from the cadre with that hair and skin. Bet she washes out before we even get to the long-range lanes." The words stung, though she kept her expression stone still. She thought of the years that had brought her here, the nights in combat zones, listening for enemy footsteps, the hours of practice on ranges where her bullets carved patterns tighter than any of her peers, the mentors who told her she was wasting her potential if she didn't chase this tab. Those memories drowned the noise. Caroline finished oiling her rifle, reassembled it, and set it carefully on the rack. She lay back on the bunk, staring at the ceiling fan, turning lazily overhead. Tomorrow would be worse. Tomorrow always was. But as sleep began to drag her under, she felt a calmness others didn't. Doubt would eat them alive before it touched her. She had already made peace with pain. The sniper school didn't need her words. It would hear her truth soon enough, in the language of steel and distance, in the echo of bullets finding their mark. And when that time came, every whisper, every sneer, every doubt would be silenced the way only a rifle could silence them. Sharp, undeniable, final. The dawn whistle pierced the barracks long before the sky shifted from black to gray. Soldiers rolled from their bunks with groans, boots thudding against the concrete floor. Caroline Hayes swung her legs over the edge, her body aching from the previous day's march. Her shoulders burned where straps had chewed into her skin, and her calves throbbed like fire. She knew better than to linger. At sniper school, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was hunted like blood in the water. By the time she reached the parade ground, the air already carried the sticky weight of southern humidity. The formation of candidates stood with rucks and rifles at their sides, shadows stretching long across the gravel. An instructor paced in front of them like a wolf among prey. His voice carried over the group with sharp precision. "You think you're tired now? This is nothing. This is breakfast. If you can't eat pain for breakfast, you're already finished." The day began with another march. The terrain was merciless rolling hills, rutted paths, and loose rock that threatened ankles with every step. 70 pounds of gear dragged on their shoulders, pulling spines into aching arcs. Sweat-soaked uniforms until they clung like second skin. Caroline fixed her gaze on the soldier ahead, forcing herself into rhythm. Left, right. Left, right. At the first incline, one candidate faltered, stumbling under the weight of his ruck. Instructors swarmed him instantly. "Drop and give me 50. You think this course cares about your legs?" His arms buckled after 20 push-ups, face grinding into the dirt. The ruck was pulled from his back, tossed into a truck. Out, go pack your gear. You're done. The line moved on, leaving him behind. Carolyn felt the burn in her thighs, but she pressed forward. Each hill, each blistering step, was another chance for someone to quit. She would not be that someone. She clenched her jaw, swallowed the taste of iron in her mouth, and kept moving. By mid-March, sweat had carved rivers through the dirt caked on her face. Her uniform was soaked, her boots squelching with every step. Still, she pushed herself harder when she noticed the instructor's eyes on her. They weren't watching the strongest men. They were watching her, waiting for cracks. The end of the march brought no relief. The candidates were funneled directly into marksmanship drills. Heat shimmered off the range as targets stretched into the distance. They lay prone on mats, rifles braced, while instructors barked commands. 300 meters. Adjust for wind, fire. A thunder of rifles filled the air. The metallic clang of rounds on steel followed, but not every shot found its mark. Instructors stalked the line, snapping at mistakes, demanding perfection. Caroline adjusted her scope, reading the subtle movement of the range flags. Her shot cracked, hitting steel with a clear ring. Another followed, then another, each shot steady, deliberate. Sweat rolled down her temple, blurring her vision, but she refused to blink until the last round was fired. Beside her, a candidate cursed under his breath as his shot missed wide. An instructor descended on him instantly. Pathetic. You think wind cares about your excuses? He slammed his clipboard shut. You'll never make it past stalking week. Carolyn reloaded quietly, ignoring the tension. Her weapon was not just a tool. It was her proof. That night, exhaustion crept into her bones like poison. The barracks smelled of sweat, leather, and disinfectant. Candidates stripped boots from blistered feet, groaning as they collapsed onto bunks. Caroline sat cross-legged on her mattress, disassembling her rifle by touch, laying each piece out with surgical precision. The whispers floated again, carried across the room like smoke. She won't last. Watch her fold when the pressure really hits. She's good on the range, but stalking will crush her. No way she keeps this pace. Carolyn said nothing. Her fingers worked steadily, wiping each piece of her rifle with cloth until it gleamed under the dim overhead light. She could feel their eyes on her, the mixture of doubt and curiosity. She didn't need to defend herself. The rifle would do it for her. The second week layered new punishments onto the old. Sleep became rationed, precious as water. Candidates were yanked from bunks in the dead of night for timed sprints or surprise drills. Food was scarce, barely enough to keep muscles moving. Fatigue fogged their minds, making simple calculations blur into nonsense. Caroline fought through it all with the same discipline she carried from combat deployments. She had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep, to march on blistered feet, to steady a rifle with trembling hands. Pain was not new. What was new was the magnifying glass she lived under. Every stumble, every hesitation, drew sharper rebukes from instructors when it came from her. During a classroom lecture on wind drift, she scribbled notes furiously, while others slouched half asleep. The equations stacked in her notebook like Wall's Milleradian's angular minutes, crosswind values. When an instructor fired a question into the room, her hand went up before anyone else's. She answered with crisp confidence, and the instructor gave a slow nod. The soldier beside her muttered, "Teacher's pet." She ignored him, eyes fixed on the chalkboard. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here for mastery. By the end of the second week, the class had thinned. A dozen were gone washed out, injured, or quit. Their bunks stood empty in the barracks, gear stripped away, as though they had never been there. Caroline remained, tired but unbroken. She noticed, though, how the whispers around her began to change. She's still here. Not bad for 2 weeks. Maybe she's tougher than she looks. It wasn't respect yet. But it wasn't dismissal either. It was the beginning of doubt that their predictions of her failure would come true. One evening, after a 14-hour day of drills, Caroline walked to the range alone. The sun was setting, staining the sky in streaks of orange and red. She lay prone, bracing her rifle, and aimed at distant steel. The world narrowed to her breathing, her heartbeat, the squeeze of her trigger. Each shot rang with clarity, echoing across the empty field. She wasn't practicing just for herself. She was sharpening her edge against the chorus of voices that had followed her from the moment she enlisted. Each round was a reminder that the rifle, and only the rifle, would speak the truth. When she finally lowered the weapon and stood, the field was quiet, the air cooling as night descended. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and walked back toward the barracks, her boots crunching in the gravel. Tomorrow would bring more pain, more trials, more chances to fail. But tonight, she carried with her the steady rhythm of steel ringing in the distance, a sound no whisper could silence. Caroline Hayes was still standing, and that fact alone made her dangerous. The morning of the first stalking exercise arrived cloaked in silence. The candidates stood at the edge of a wide training field, rifles slung, ghillie suits bundled under their arms. A thin mist clung to the grass, the kind of haze that softened edges and made distance feel infinite. To most, it looked peaceful. To the soldiers standing there, it looked like judgment. The lead instructor's voice carried over them, like gravel dragged across metal. Out there are trained observers. They know what to look for. Your job is to move through that field unseen, position your rifle, and put eyes on the target. If they spot you, you fail. Simple as that. Nothing about it was simple. The observers perched in towers with high-powered optics, scanning for the tiniest twitch of movement or glint of metal. The candidates had to become ghosts, blending into the earth itself, every inch of movement a calculation. Even seasoned infantrymen hated this part. Caroline pulled her ghillie suit over her uniform. The heavy burlap and stitched vegetation scratched her skin, clung to sweat, and reeked faintly of mud from weeks of prior use. She knelt and tied in fresh grass and leaves, weaving them with steady hands. Her breathing slowed, her mind narrowing to the task ahead. When her number was called, she dropped prone at the start line. The world shrank to a horizon of tall grass and uneven ground. She inched forward, rifle cradled, elbows dragging in the dirt. Each movement had to be deliberate, matched to the rhythm of the wind stirring the blades around her. She counted seconds in her head, pausing every few breaths to let stillness settle. Minutes stretched into hours. The tower loomed closer, its silhouette framed in the crosshairs of her scope. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't dare wipe it away. She adjusted, moved again, then froze. A sharp crack echoed the instructor's whistle. Number 12 exposed. Her stomach dropped. From the tower, an observer had caught the faint gleam of her rifle barrel where the burlap hadn't fully covered it. The exercise ended instantly. She rose from the grass, humiliated, as laughter spilled from the tower. Candidates watching from the sidelines smirked. One voice carried just loud enough. Knew she wouldn't last. Caroline's face burned as she walked back toward the start point. The failure wasn't just hers. It felt like confirmation of every whisper, every doubt that had followed her into this course. She stripped off her ghillie suit with stiff hands, dirt caked across her face. That night in the barracks, silence pressed heavy around her. Some soldiers failed quietly and packed their gear, resigned to defeat. She wasn't packing. Not yet. She sat on the floor, pulling the suit into her lap, inspecting every flaw. The burlap was too loose in places, vegetation tied in sloppily, shadows uneven. She had rushed, trusting her field instincts instead of respecting the art of invisibility. She rebuilt it from the ground up, each knot tied tighter, each strip of cloth positioned with care. She clipped grass until her fingers were raw, weaving it until the fabric looked less like clothing and more like earth itself. By the time she finished, her hands were cut and bleeding, but her suit breathed like a second skin. The next day, when her turn came again, she dropped prone without hesitation. The ground was wet from morning dew, seeping into her uniform. She ignored it. Every inch forward was deliberate move an elbow, freeze. Push a knee, freeze. She aligned her breaths with the sway of the grass, her body becoming part of the rhythm. Insects crawled over her arms, biting through the fabric, but she didn't flinch. Her rifle was wrapped so tightly in burlap and vegetation that no surface glinted in the light. Hours passed. She became part of the earth, her heartbeat slowing until even that felt under control. When the tower finally filled her scope, she aligned the crosshairs on the instructor's chest and squeezed. The crack of the blank round echoed. Observers swung binoculars, searching frantically. Nothing. Caroline held still, motionless, while the silence stretched. Finally, the call came from the tower. Target not visible, the order came for her to reveal herself. She stood, rising like a shadow from the grass, not 15 yards from the tower. Murmurs rippled across the field. The instructor's eyes locked on hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he gave the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, before turning back to the formation. It wasn't praise. Praise didn't exist here. But that nod was heavier than any applause she had ever known. That evening, the whispers in the barracks sounded different. Did you see how close she got? They couldn't even find her. Guess she figured it out. Caroline sat silently on her bunk, stitching another piece of burlap into her ghillie suit. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. The course was still waiting to break her. But for the first time, she felt the weight of proof shift ever so slightly. Her failure the day before had been public. So had her redemption. Both had taught her the same lesson sniper school was not about talent. It was about persistence. Every mistake carried pain. Every success carried cost. What mattered was the refusal to quit in the face of humiliation. Lying in the darkness of the barracks that night, she replayed the day in her mind. The laughter, the failure, the sting of shame. Then the stillness of the field, the breathless silence when the observers couldn't find her, the nod from the instructor. She understood something she hadn't before. The rifle spoke, yes. But so did silence, so did patience, so did the will to crawl an inch at a time when everything screamed to quit. Tomorrow would bring another trial, another chance to stumble. But Caroline Hayes knew now what the course demanded. It didn't demand perfection. It demanded that she refuse to stay broken. The mist was gone the next morning, burned off by the Georgia sun that climbed higher with every breath. The field stretched out in front of the candidates, a rippling sea of tall grass and underbrush. The towers loomed at the far end, their glass glinting like watchful eyes. For most soldiers, this exercise was misery. For Caroline, it was redemption. She had rebuilt her ghillie suit the night before, stitching until her fingers were raw, until the burlap and tied vegetation seemed to breathe with her. Every thread, every knot was intentional. The failures of yesterday still burned in her memory, but so did the nod she had earned. Today she would not stumble. Today she would disappear. Number 12 on the line. Her number. Caroline dropped prone, rifle cradled carefully against her body. The ground was damp from the night's dew, cold seeping through her uniform. She felt the dirt press into her skin, smelled the faint musk of wet grass. The world narrowed instantly, her vision reduced to the blades in front of her face. the distant tower, and the endless crawl between. She began to move. An elbow slid forward, no faster than the creeping of a shadow. Her knee pushed, shifting her body by inches. Every movement stopped the moment the wind stilled. She froze, body locking into the landscape. A beetle crawled across her cheek. She did not flinch. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into endless loops of stillness and crawl, stillness and crawl. The sun rose higher, baking the back of her neck beneath layers of burlap. Sweat trickled down her spine, soaking her undershirt, but she embraced the discomfort. If she focused on the pain, she'd fail. So she focused on rhythm. Breathe, move, freeze. Observers scanned the field from the tower, binoculars glinting as they swept back and forth. Caroline knew their game. They weren't just looking for soldiers. They were waiting for the twitch of impatience, the betrayal of a hurried move, the glimmer of steel or glass in the light. She became smaller than thought, smaller than breath. She became the ground. Halfway through, a gust of wind rippled across the grass. Caroline shifted with it, aligning her crawl to its movement. The stalk was a dance, and she had learned the steps. She slid forward, let the wind mask her advance, then froze again. Every inch carried weight. Every mistake could be fatal. Finally, the tower grew close enough to fill her scope. Through the crosshairs, the silhouette of the instructor sharpened. His stance was casual, clipboard in one hand, scanning the horizon. She exhaled, steadying her heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the blank round echoed faintly across the field. Observers whipped binoculars to the grass, eyes hunting furiously. Caroline did not move. She did not breathe. She became a shadow in plain sight. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Still, they could not find her. Number 12, reveal. Slowly, deliberately, Caroline rose from the grass. Burlap rustled softly as she emerged not 30 yards from the tower. Gasps rippled from the sidelines where other candidates watched. She had been right under their noses. The instructor in the tower looked down at her. Their eyes met. He gave the smallest of nods, his face unreadable, before turning away. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Caroline, it was everything. In a place where praise was rarer than rain in the desert, that nod carried the weight of recognition. She walked back to the line, rifle slung across her back, ignoring the stares of her classmates. Some looked away, their doubt fractured. Others studied her with new wariness, as though seeing her for the first time. That night in the barracks, the whispers sounded different. She got right up on them. They couldn't even see her. Maybe she knows what she's doing after all. Caroline didn't smile. She didn't speak. She sat on her bunk, stitching more grass into her suit, methodical as ever. Respect was fragile here. Today's success meant nothing tomorrow. Every morning reset the slate, and the course waited hungrily to break the overconfident. But privately, she allowed herself one truth. She had proven, if only for a moment, that she could outthink the eyes in the tower. She had proven that failure didn't define her. What defined her was the refusal to quit. The next days repeated the trial. Some candidates who had mocked her earlier now struggled, their movements too fast, their camouflage too sloppy. They were spotted, flagged, and humiliated. Caroline, by contrast, only grew sharper. She learned how to use shadows at dawn, how to let a single blade of grass conceal an entire hand, how to time her crawl to the exact rhythm of swaying leaves. Each stalk was grueling, but each stalk became easier, as though the earth itself was teaching her to vanish. One afternoon, a fellow candidate, Corporal Matthews, broad-shouldered and arrogant, collapsed beside her during a break. He wiped mud from his face and muttered, "Thought you'd wash out." "Guess I was wrong." Caroline glanced at him, then back at the field. Guess so. It wasn't camaraderie, not yet. But it wasn't disdain either. It was the beginning of something that felt almost like respect. Instructors still rode her harder than the rest. When others moved too quickly, they barked warnings. When she twitched a fraction of an inch, they roared as though she'd committed treason. But Caroline had come to understand their game. They weren't testing her camouflage anymore. They were testing her resolve. Late one evening, after another full day of crawling through mud and grass, she lay awake on her bunk. The barracks buzzed with snores and restless shifting, but her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling fan turning slowly above. Her body ached, her muscles screamed for rest, yet her mind was calm. She had survived the laughter, the humiliation, the endless crawling. And not just survived, she had thrived. Caroline Hayes had disappeared into the earth and emerged stronger. The forest had swallowed her whole, but instead of breaking her, it had taught her how to become invisible. Tomorrow would bring new trials, longer distances, tighter calculations, greater fatigue. But tonight, she carried the quiet power of knowing she could vanish in plain sight, and no one, not even the sharpest eyes in the tower, could deny it. The Georgia sun had no mercy. By mid-morning, the range shimmered with heat, waves rising off the sand like ghosts. Candidates lined up in their firing positions, rifles stretched out before them. Their uniforms clung to their bodies, soaked in sweat and grime. Some had eyes red from sleepless nights. Others yawned between commands, their fatigue a visible enemy. Caroline Hayes lay prone at the far end of the line. Her cheek pressed against the stock of her M2010, her heartbeat thudding softly in her ears. She adjusted the rifle until it felt like a natural extension of her body. The scope revealed a blur of shapes, targets set at varying distances across the field. The instructors hadn't made this easy. Distances jumped wildly 400 yards, then 700, then out to 1,200, where a steel silhouette barely glimmered in the haze. Winds shifting right. An instructor barked, his voice cracking through the air. Compensate or don't bother wasting my ammunition. Caroline inhaled slowly, ignoring the bite of the words. She had learned not to let the constant criticism dig too deep. Their job was to break her spirit, but she had built walls higher than their voices. She adjusted her scope, factoring in the subtle rightward push of the wind. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger, the pad steady, no tremor. She exhaled, squeezed. The steel at 400 yards rang with a sharp clang. Good shot, the spotter muttered, barely audible, but it was enough. The next target loomed farther out. The mirage effect from the heat made the silhouette dance. Caroline adjusted elevation, dialed carefully, and waited for her breathing to steady. Sweat dripped into her eye, stinging. She blinked it away, refusing to break concentration. Another squeeze. The steel at 700 yards jumped. Fatigue gnawed at her bones. The day before, they'd been dragged across the training grounds for hours, rucksacks overloaded, boots digging into blisters, shoulders aching. Sleep had been rationed to only a few hours. By the time she reached the firing line, her muscles trembled with every movement. But she had one advantage. She knew how to fight through pain. Combat had taught her that misery wasn't the end. It was the threshold you crossed before clarity set in. At 900 yards, the first round missed. The steel stayed silent. A hollow thud of dirt exploded just short. Hayes! The instructor's roar echoed. Wasting ammo. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She simply adjusted. She had overcompensated for wind. She recalculated, dialed back, and exhaled again. The next shot cracked, the bullet flying true. The steel rang, faint but definite. The instructor grunted, moving down the line to bark at someone else. Caroline's focus tunneled. one shot at a time, one calculation at a time. Each pull of the trigger carried weight, not just in ammunition, but in proof that she wasn't there by accident, proof that she could perform under the crushing weight of fatigue and scrutiny. By the time she reached the 1,200-yard target, her body felt leaden. The scope wavered slightly, her arms shaking from hours of strain. She pressed her elbows deeper into the earth, anchoring herself. She remembered her training. Build a natural point of aim. Trust the fundamentals. Let the rifle breathe with you. She saw the target shimmer in the haze, barely a shape at the edge of vision. She adjusted windage, accounted for the long drop, and drew in a deep breath. The shot cracked. Seconds stretched like hours. Then, faint and distant, a metallic ring floated back across the field. A hush settled, broken only by the sound of other rifles firing. Caroline allowed herself the faintest smile. The next hours blurred into repetition. Shoot, adjust, shoot again. Instructors prowled like wolves, snapping at mistakes, but Caroline tuned them out. Her rifle spoke louder than any criticism. Every hit was a sentence, every clang a declaration. She didn't need applause. She needed truth, and her rifle provided it. By afternoon, exhaustion had turned brutal. Candidates' arms shook, their shots went wide, tempers flared. Some cursed openly after misses. One slammed his fist into the dirt, muttering that he was done. The instructors circled, taking notes, watching for collapse. Caroline felt her own fatigue threaten to drag her down. Her eyes burned, her shoulders ached, and her stomach clenched with hunger. But she pushed the sensations away, compartmentalizing them. Misery didn't matter. Precision did. When the final command came, last volley. She adjusted her scope one more time. The target stood at 800 yards, steady in the late daylight. Her breathing slowed, the chaos around her falling silent. Exhale, squeeze. The steel rang once more. She rolled onto her back, closing her eyes for just a second, the rifle resting across her chest. Around her, some celebrated survival, others cursed their failure. Caroline simply breathed, steady and calm. The instructors recorded scores, muttering among themselves. She didn't need to hear the numbers. She already knew the truth. She had landed her shots, even under the crushing weight of fatigue. She had proven that she could not just endure, but perform. That evening, in the chow hall, the whispers followed her again. She doesn't miss much. She keeps hitting when the rest of us fall apart. She's like a machine. Caroline sat quietly, spooning food into her mouth without acknowledgement. Machines didn't need praise. They just needed to work. When she returned to her bunk, she laid her rifle across her lap and began cleaning it with slow, deliberate care. Each piece gleamed as she wiped it down, each part checked and rechecked. It wasn't just maintenance, it was ritual, a way to remind herself that her rifle wasn't just steel and glass. It was her voice, her truth, her equalizer. Outside, the night insects sang. Inside, the barracks smelled of oil and sweat. Caroline's hands moved steadily, her mind already preparing for tomorrow. Because tomorrow, they would push harder. Tomorrow, fatigue would claw deeper. And tomorrow, her rifle would have to speak again. The morning sun rose like a hammer, beating down on the Georgia training grounds with relentless heat. By the time the candidates reached the long-range field, sweat already streaked their uniforms. The air shimmered, mirage waves dancing over the sand and grass. At the far end of the range, steel silhouettes stood waiting, some nearly invisible through the haze. This was the culminating test target stretched past 1,000 yards, a brutal gauntlet that exposed weakness with unforgiving clarity. For weeks, the candidates had crawled through mud, sweated through lectures, and shouldered the crushing weight of fatigue. But here, skill spoke louder than endurance. Here, every mistake echoed. Targets are live, an instructor barked, clipboard in hand. You'll fire at each distance, one round at a time. Fail to adjust, fail to read the wind, and the steel will stay silent. And if it stays silent, you don't belong here. Carolyn Hayes lay prone, her rifle cradled in her arms. She adjusted her bipod, pressed her cheek against the stock, and let her scope sweep the field. The closest target was at 600 yards, already a challenge in the shimmering heat. Farther out, at 1,100 yards, the silhouettes blurred, ghostly against the horizon. Around her, candidates muttered curses, adjusted scopes, and exchanged nervous glances. The fatigue of the course was carved into their faces, shoulders sagging, eyes hollow. Some were already broken. Others clung to hope. Carolyn felt the same exhaustion in her bones, but she had learned to welcome it. Fatigue stripped away pretense. Fatigue left only truth. And truth was all she needed. Number 12, the spotter beside her said, "You're up." She inhaled slowly, feeling the rise of her chest press against the ground. Through her scope, the 600-yard target shimmered. She adjusted windage, dialed elevation, and let the world narrow to a single point. Exhale, squeeze, the shot cracked, and the steel rang with a sharp, clean note. The spotter grunted approval. Send it again. Caroline moved to the 800-yard target, slightly left, smaller now through the glass. The mirage bent the shape, warping it like water. She read the wind flag rippling steady, but with subtle gusts. She adjusted, shifted her body, and fired. The steel rang again, faint but certain. Her classmates were struggling. Missed shots thudded into dirt. Curses filled the air. Instructors barked insults. Sweat dripped into eyes. Hands trembled on triggers. The further the target stretched, the more the cracks showed. At 1,000 yards, Caroline slowed her breathing even further. This wasn't about speed. It was about patience, about absolute trust in fundamentals. She studied the flag. She tasted the air. She remembered every lecture drilled into her about Coriolis effect, bullet drop, and the subtle art of wind calls. Exhale. Squeeze. The round sailed across the field, vanishing into the haze. For a moment, silence. Then clang. The steel sang. Her spotter chuckled softly. "You've got it dialed, Sergeant." Caroline didn't answer. She wasn't shooting for him. She wasn't shooting for the instructors or the classmates whispering about her behind her back. She was shooting for herself, for the truth only a bullet could tell. The final target stood at 1,200 yards, barely visible through the dancing air. It seemed unreal, a phantom on the edge of vision. Many candidates had already failed here, their bullets scattering into sand, their faces collapsing into despair. Caroline adjusted her scope, fingers precise despite the tremble of exhaustion. She dialed elevation, checked windage, and pressed her elbows into the earth to steady her aim. Through the glass, the silhouette swayed like a ghost. She closed her eyes for a moment. In that instant, she remembered every doubt, every sneer, every voice that had told her she didn't belong. She remembered the laughter when she'd failed her first stalk, the endless scrutiny of the instructors, the fatigue that had clawed at her soul. She remembered, and then she let it go. She opened her eyes. All that remained was the rifle, the target, and the breath in her chest. Exhale. Squeeze. The shot cracked, echoing across the field. Seconds dragged, the silence unbearable. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the metallic ring of steel. For a moment, the entire range seemed to still. The spotter whispered, almost reverent, "Hit." Caroline exhaled, her body sinking into the earth. She didn't smile. She didn't pump a fist or look for approval. She simply absorbed the sound, the truth ringing across the distance. Instructors scribbled on their clipboards, murmuring among themselves. One glanced her way, expression unreadable. Around her, some candidates stared openly. Others looked away, their pride wounded. She didn't care. The rifle had spoken, and its voice was undeniable. The exercise continued, but for Caroline, the moment lingered. She had not just hit steel. She had silenced every whisper. She had proven that precision was not bound by gender, not bound by doubt, not bound by anything except discipline and will. When the final ceasefire was called, candidates stumbled to their feet, some dejected, some relieved. Caroline rose calmly, slinging her rifle across her back. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, her uniform heavy with grime. But her eyes were steady, her steps firm. That night, in the barracks, the whispers were different again. She hit 1,200 like it was nothing. Even the instructors were watching her. She's locked in. Caroline sat on her bunk, silent as always, methodically cleaning her rifle. Each stroke of the cloth across the barrel felt like a ritual, a conversation. The weapon gleamed under her care, as though acknowledging her in return. When she finished, she set it gently across her lap and leaned back against the wall. Outside, the night pressed quiet against the windows. Inside, the barracks buzzed with low voices, some grudging respect, some disbelief. Caroline didn't listen. She didn't need to. The range had already told the story. Her rifle had spoken, and the truth could not be ignored. The classroom smelled of dust, sweat, and faint gun oil. The walls were bare, the lights buzzing softly overhead. Candidates filed in slowly, boots dragging across the floor. The long-range exercise had drained them, and every movement carried the weight of exhaustion. But today's trial wasn't on the range. Today, the test would come from one another. Peer evaluations, the lead instructor announced, voice cold and clipped. He held a stack of papers in his hand, crisp sheets that looked innocent enough, but carried enormous weight. You'll evaluate your classmates. Honesty, only. Strengths, weaknesses, and whether you trust them in combat. Don't waste my time with flattery or lies. If you can't tell the truth about the person beside you, then you don't belong here either. Murmurs rippled across the room, low and tense. Peer evaluations were notorious in sniper school. Brutal, unforgiving, and often more damaging than any failed shot. Candidates could tolerate failure from themselves, but betrayal or judgment from their peers cut deeper than any instructor's words. Caroline sat near the back, silent as always, a pencil balanced loosely in her hand. She knew what was coming. She had heard the whispers since day one, felt the stares burning into her back during every drill. She expected venom, dismissal, maybe even sabotage. It didn't matter. Evaluations couldn't strip away the truth she had carved with every shot. The papers were handed out. Each sheet listed the roster of names. Candidates hunched over desks, pencils scratching, the room filling with the soft murmur of thought. Some glanced sideways, suspicion in their eyes. Others wrote quickly, with grim certainty. Caroline lowered her gaze to the sheet in front of her. Her pencil hovered. She could have been ruthless, cutting down those who mocked her. She could have written truth so sharp it drew blood. But she didn't. She wrote carefully, honestly, who was disciplined, who faltered under pressure, who steadied in chaos. Because the evaluation wasn't about grudges. It was about the battlefield. And on the battlefield, pettiness killed. Minutes stretched. The air grew heavy. Finally, the instructor collected the sheets, stacking them neatly under one arm. He scanned the room, his gaze hard. You'll never see what your classmates wrote about you, he said. But their words matter more than you think. Peer trust is the foundation of this profession. If they don't trust you, you're worthless with a rifle. The candidates filed out slowly, the tension following them like a storm cloud. Conversations erupted in hushed voices. Some bragged about what they'd written. Others joked nervously, masking their anxiety. Caroline said nothing. She walked back to the barracks with her usual calm, ignoring the sidelong glances. That night, the results circulated not officially, but through the grapevine that no class could suppress. In the dim light of the barracks, whispers carried across bunks. She got ranked higher than I thought. Some of the guys put her down as reliable. No way. For real? Caroline lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above. She could hear the disbelief in their voices, but also something else, an edge of respect creeping in, reluctant but undeniable. Corporal Matthews, the broad-shouldered candidate who had once dismissed her openly, sat nearby lacing his boots. He looked up, catching her eye for the first time, without smirk or scorn. "You know," he muttered, voice low so others couldn't hear, "I wrote that I'd trust you in combat." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you believed that?" He shrugged. "Didn't at first. But you don't flinch. You don't whine. You just get it done. That counts." She didn't smile. She simply nodded. That was enough. Over the next days, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The jabs and jokes that once followed her quiet presence grew less frequent. When she entered the chow hall, the conversations didn't always fall silent anymore. A few even made space for her at the table. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't warmth. But it was respect, earned the hard way. The instructors noticed, too. During drills, their voices stayed sharp, but their eyes lingered on her with something different than before. They no longer treated her as an anomaly. She was simply another sniper candidate, judged by the same brutal standard. One evening, after a grueling day of stalking lanes, Caroline sat outside the barracks with her rifle laid across her knees, cleaning it as the sun dipped low. The sky burned orange, cicadas buzzing in the trees. Matthews approached, dropping onto the step beside her with a grunt. "You ever get tired of being watched?" he asked. Caroline didn't look up. "Always. Doesn't matter." He chuckled. "Guess it doesn't. You've got half the class convinced you're some kind of ghost with that rifle. Even the instructors can't deny it anymore." Caroline finished wiping the bolt and slid it carefully back into place. She finally glanced at him. "I don't need them to like me. I just need them to know I belong here." Matthews nodded slowly. "They know." The words hung in the humid air, simple and solid. For the first time, Caroline felt the weight of the course shift. The battle wasn't over. The hardest days still loomed ahead, but the tide had turned. She had come in as an outsider, dismissed and doubted. Now, piece by piece, respect was being written in silence, in nods, in grudging admissions. Later that week, the lead instructor gathered the class at dusk, the sky bleeding purple behind him. He scanned the formation, eyes sharp. "Evaluations are in," he said flatly. "They tell me what I already knew. Some of you can't be trusted. Some of you won't last. And some of you," his gaze swept across them, pausing for the briefest second on Caroline, "are exactly what this school was built for." He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The message was clear. That night, as Caroline lay in her bunk, the whispers sounded different than they had weeks ago. No laughter. No derision. Only the low hum of soldiers acknowledging something they couldn't deny anymore. She had been tested, measured, and judged not just by instructors, but by the very men who once wanted her gone. And though their respect wasn't loud, it was real. For Caroline, that was victory enough. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried a hint of dew and the faint smell of pine from the surrounding forest. The candidates assembled on the parade ground, rifles slung across their backs, boots tapping against the gravel in a steady rhythm. Today wasn't just another exercise, it was graduation day. The culmination of weeks of exhaustion, pain, and relentless trials. Carolyn Hayes stood among them, shoulders squared, uniform neat, despite the grime of countless drills. She had endured long marches, scorching sun, bitter wind, and sleepless nights. She had crawled through mud, vanished into grass, and fired her rifle at impossible distances. She had faced doubt, whispered scorn, and the weight of expectation. And she had prevailed. The instructors formed the line at the front, clipboards tucked under arms, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, the last of the targets and training equipment scattered across the range testified to the weeks of brutal training. Today, they would measure not just skill, but proof. Proof that each soldier was ready to be entrusted with the sniper tab. The lead instructor stepped forward, voice sharp enough to carry across the parade ground. This course is designed to break you, to test your mind, your body, and your will. Only those who endure, who persevere under scrutiny, and who can execute under pressure, earn the right to wear the sniper tab. Each of you has been measured against the harshest standard imaginable. Few of you will make it. Some of you are already marked for failure. The candidates shifted, a ripple of unease running through the line. Caroline's eyes, however, remained steady. She had been marked, doubted, and watched, but she had not wavered. One by one, names were called. Some candidates stepped forward to receive the tab, their faces a mix of relief and pride. Others faltered, their names echoing into silence, failure written across the line of their shoulders. When her name was finally called, "Hayes, Carolyn," the air seemed to shift. Conversations hushed, heads turned. A few of her classmates exchanged surprised glances. She had been underestimated for weeks. She walked to the front, every step deliberate, boots crunching against gravel. Her rifle was slung over her shoulder, her ghillie suit carefully stowed, replaced by the standard uniform of a sniper candidate who had endured the storm. She approached the instructor, who held the sniper tab in his hand. "Carolyn Hayes," he said evenly, "you have demonstrated precision under extreme conditions, patience under pressure, and the ability to perform when others faltered. You have earned this." He pinned the tab onto her uniform. It gleamed faintly in the morning sun, a symbol of achievement so hard-won it felt almost sacred. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her hands in triumph. She simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of the accomplishment. The rifle across her back had spoken her truth long before this moment. The tab was simply the world's recognition. As she returned to her place in formation, murmurs followed her. Some were whispers of admiration. Some were quiet acknowledgement that her presence had shifted the dynamics of the class. The officers didn't need to say it aloud. Her skill and persistence spoke louder than any words could. The ceremony continued, each graduate called forward, each name etched into memory with sweat, pain, and steel. Caroline's peers clapped quietly, some grudgingly, others with open respect. Matthews, standing a few rows back, gave a subtle nod. It wasn't exuberant, but it was enough. She had earned their recognition, not through words, but through action. When the ceremony ended, the candidates filed off the parade ground. Caroline paused, rifle slung, tab glinting against her chest. She looked out across the training field, the tall grass still swaying faintly in the morning breeze. It had been the same terrain that had tried to humble her, the same ground where she had crawled through mud, sweat, and humiliation. And yet she had mastered it. A quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. The course had not broken her. It had refined her. Each failure, each sleepless night, each ounce of pain had led to this singular truth. She belonged. Not because she had sought approval, not because she had desired recognition, but because she had endured. Later, as the graduates gathered for final inspection, instructors approached each candidate with brief nods, acknowledgments measured and sparse. Caroline received a glance that lingered slightly longer, a subtle recognition of her perseverance and skill. She didn't need accolades. She had earned her place. That evening, in the barracks, the class was quieter than usual. Some slept immediately, bodies too drained to speak. Others cleaned equipment methodically, reflecting on the trials they had survived. Caroline, as always, worked carefully on her rifle. She disassembled each component, wiping it clean, checking every sight, every bolt, every trigger. The rifle was more than a tool. It was the voice she had relied upon when whispers and doubt threatened to drown her. Outside, night descended softly, stars pricking the black sky. The hum of insects filled the air. The barracks smelled faintly of oil, sweat, and the forest beyond. Caroline leaned back, rifle across her lap, tab gleaming against her chest. She allowed herself a single deep breath. The wariness, the fear, the self-doubt, all of it had been earned, fought through, and left behind on the field. The silence spoke louder than applause. The rifle had spoken first, proving her in ways words could never reach. The tab had followed, affirming what the weapon already knew. She had faced the instructors, the peers, and herself, and emerged unbroken. Caroline Hayes had arrived as an underdog, doubted and dismissed. She had endured the heat, the humiliation, the weight of every bullet fired in frustration or triumph. She had vanished into grass, commanded her rifle across impossible distances, and earned the grudging respect of even the harshest instructors. And now, she stood as proof that persistence, discipline, and quiet mastery could speak louder than any prejudice, louder than doubt, louder than fear. In that quiet barracks, with her rifle resting across her lap and the sniper tab pinned firmly to her chest, Caroline smiled, not at anyone, not for anyone. She smiled for herself. The rifle had spoken. The course had listened. And she had finally claimed her voice in a world that had tried to silence it.